Good evening, everyone. I'm hoping that we are live and that you can see us. I am Terry Hoard Owens, honored to serve as General Minister and President for the Christian Church Disciples of Christ in the U.S. and Canada. And tonight I have with me not just two brilliant women, but two good friends. Dr. Leah Gunning Francis, who is the Academic Dean, Vice President of Academic Affairs, and also Associate Professor of Practical Theology at Christian Theological Seminary in Indianapolis, and the Reverend Sandhya Jha, founder and executive director of the Oakland Peace Center in Oakland, California. I invited these two women to a conversation in light of the serious uprising that's occurred in our country, particularly with the tipping point of the murder of George Floyd in May in Minneapolis. 5 years ago, each of these women wrote books that dealt with stories. Sandhya's book, Pre-Post-Racial America, Stories from the Front Line, dealt with stories of lots of different folks, of people of color. Leah was at Eden Theological Seminary, really at ground zero in the St. Louis area during 2014 in the aftermath of the shooting by police of Michael Brown, and was able to interview lots of young leaders and clergy as a result of that. We wanted to talk tonight not only about men, but really about their reflections on what's happening in this moment, what we have learned, what we should have learned, and then finally what they feel is most important in terms of our steps to act and move both as people of faith, as institutional churches, and as communities across the US particularly. I want to invite them both to share a little bit, to give you some context about their work before we begin the conversation. But I do want to invite you, if you are watching on Facebook Live, please share this conversation on your page so that we can get more folks listening and sharing in the conversation. It is being streamed live to the Christian Church Disciples of Christ Facebook page, as well as the Christian Church Disciples of Christ YouTube. So hopefully those of you who are watching us live will be able to share and sort of multiply our audience. We're grateful to those of you who are logged in via Zoom as part of our webinar. Later, when we ask for questions, we'll ask you to put those questions into the chat. You won't be able to chat with one another in this process. We want to keep the focus on our two speakers for tonight. So welcome, and I look forward to this conversation. Been looking forward to it for a few weeks now. So Leah, let's start with you, or Dr. Francis. I know you as Leah, so hopefully, can I call you Leah tonight? Dean Francis.
Of course. Thank you so much. We are just so ecstatic to be able to come together as friends, as colleagues, as laborers in this movement. Good evening, everyone. My name is Leah Gunning Francis, or I'm currently serving as the Dean at Christian Theological Seminary, as the President and General Minister Owens has said so kindly. And as we know, we find ourselves yet again in another moment that should not have happened. In August of 2014, when Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri by a Ferguson police officer, we saw immediately how so many young people said, enough. We've had enough of this. We are tired of the racial profiling. We're tired of being deemed criminal. We're tired of being deemed as less than human. And it was really more than they could bear. And so they took to the streets. They camped out in front of the police station. They said, we're not going until we get answers. And over time, you had more and more people coming out to join. And one of the groups of people that I was interested in particular, and learning more about and how we were engaging were clergy, were faith leaders, because so many of us believe that the work of racial justice is the work of God. It is doing the work of God. And so to join in to that type of movement is an expression of our faith. So many have said it's praying with our feet. You know, so often we'll hear people say when something tragic happens, oh, we'll pray, or too often in you know, many public spheres we'll hear people say, oh, we'll send our thoughts and prayers, when they actually have the capacity to act. Well, what we saw and what we continue to see in this movement today are people saying, no, our thoughts and prayers are not enough. Our thoughts, our prayers need to take on flesh. Our minds need to be put to work. Our hearts need to be opened and engaging and encouraging and expanding in ways that inspire and demand that Black lives do indeed matter as all other lives. And so here we are in this moment. And for as many who have said now, gosh, I just didn't know. Well, we saw similar kinds of things after the shooting death of Michael Brown and the uprising in Ferguson, where people saying, we didn't know, we didn't know. And as I've been going and talking with people over the past 6 years in churches and schools and different places and talking about Ferguson, so many people, well-meaning people, oftentimes in congregations, would say to me, Dr. Francis, you just don't understand. We're not like Ferguson. And I have to say to them, you know, Ferguson didn't know it was Ferguson until it became Ferguson. And so now here we are in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd, of seeing Breonna Taylor, knowing she was in her home and under these still no-knock warrants happening, and she is killed. Ahmaud Arbery was just merely minding his business, jogging down a residential street, and he's dead. And too many others to name that have been killed since Michael Brown was killed. And people are still kind of saying, we didn't know. Well, now we know. Now we know that we cannot continue to move forward in this way. And so we keep going with the work and inspiring and encouraging the church especially to hold true to what it says it believes.
Thank you, Leah. We're going to get back to some of the things that you said, but I want to give Sandhya Jha an opportunity just to make some introductory reflections. Sandhya is also one of our core trainers in the Disciples of Christ for our pro-reconciliation, anti-racism work, in addition to her activism in Oakland. So Sandhya, why don't you just share some initial thoughts with us?
Yeah, so it's interesting because pre-post-racial America actually emerged because of the murder of Trayvon Martin. And I think it's worth naming, for a lot of us in this work, the murders that happened in the 1990s were what got us involved in the work. For a lot of my younger colleagues, it was Trayvon Martin's murder, or Oscar Grant in Oakland's murder, that got us really engaged in this work. And so pre-post-racial America was 2/3 written when Michael Brown was murdered. And pre-post-racial America actually emerged in many ways out of the General Assembly, where we were there when Trayvon Martin's murderer was let free.
Right.
And it had a huge impact on a lot of us. And actually Chalice Press said, oh, we got to start really taking race and faith seriously. And I think that's where both Leah's and my books emerged from, was this shift in consciousness among some of the denominational leadership, which I want to honor. And it's interesting because I took on that book partly because I wanted my white friends to meet my friends of color and to realize what amazing experiences they had to draw from, but also because, having at that point in time been involved in racial justice work for 15 years, the thing that broke my heart over and over was the ways that we as people of color kept getting pitted against each other. And I wanted to create some space for us to hear each other's stories. And I think 5 years later, the work that I am most energized by is that same work, is getting to talk. I got to talk on Sunday with the Bangladeshi Women's Empowerment Network about what it means for us as South Asians to be invested in solidarity with the movement for Black lives. And that forum was actually led by people 20 years younger than me, speaking to their aunties and uncles about what it means for us to be on this soil. And this is part of the rent we pay to be in America, is that we invest ourselves in solidarity work. It's heartbreaking that the conversations that Dr. Francis and I were involved in 5 years ago are the same conversations we're having over and over again now. I think what's beautiful is the vocabulary has expanded and the possibilities have expanded, and the tolerance for tinkering around the edges has decreased significantly. And to me, that's God at work over the past 5 years and over the past 10 years and over the past 50 years. That we're actually, even in the church, being a little bit more visionary about what is possible. We're actually starting to talk about things that are big enough to be kingdom of God visions, instead of just a little less horrible for people of color frameworks. That's what I'm finding some hope in right now.
Yeah. I think the pace of change also has just been phenomenal. This moment versus 5 years ago. Leah, can you say more? I know you've had conversations as you've talked with people around the country, like, we're not Ferguson, but you don't know Ferguson didn't know it was Ferguson until it became Ferguson. So what do you see as the some of the differences between, say, Ferguson and Minneapolis, or the kind of spread that we saw in 2014 of protests and movement around the country then versus what's happening, and even the corporate response, right? Things that we thought never would happen, like Aunt Jemima's retired and the Washington Redskins are going to change their name. Can you maybe, I'm interested in your perspective on the pace and the nature of the reaction this time and how it differed from what was happening after Ferguson.
I think there were so many that were hopeful throughout the uprising in Ferguson and afterward, that this really would be the time where everybody would say enough. We cannot keep going this way, where we would see police departments around the country say, we have to revise our protocols, our practices. We have to, cities would be looking at how are we funding this and how can we really put more investment in places that are going to bring about equity and justice. But that didn't happen in the ways in which, so many were hoping. And so I think this time, where we all had to witness with our own eyes, a man being murdered, lying on a Minneapolis street, and in such a casual and happenstance manner. And unfortunately, a young lady, I believe she was 17 or so, had to stand and film the murder of Mr. Floyd. It was too much for too many people to bear. And so what we see that's different this time, we saw not only outrage erupt in Minneapolis, but immediately in Los Angeles, and immediately in Chicago, and immediately in Seattle, and immediately in Atlanta. Why? And people say, well, oh my goodness, why? What's going on? It's like, because every single time I saw a city on the news that was responding to the murder of George Floyd, I immediately thought of a person who had been killed by a police officer in that city. Right. And so what we saw was people not only responding out of their anger and despair in relation to what they saw to George Floyd, but every single city, to include the city in which I live right now, Indianapolis. There have been these murders over and over and over again. And even if there wasn't a murder in recent memory of people, there have been stops, there have been harassments, there have been near murders and whatnot. So that's something that's very different, to be able to see so quickly, so many cities say we've had enough. Second, I also think that the political climate contributed to people saying enough. Because there's so many who knew that, you know, the rhetoric, the very racist and hateful rhetoric that has been spewed across this country from very high places for the past 3.5 years, that also contributed to people saying enough. So when we look at the differences and look at, I see it more of people, you know, as we can go back to, well, you know, we can go far back, or even more recently to Rodney King, and to, you know, of course with Michael Brown, you know, Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown, and so many, Oscar Grant. There's just too many to name, where you've had people engaging and saying, we've got to stop this time, because of what we witnessed with our own eyes was enough. And so you see corporations, you see adjudicatory cities saying, we really have to make a change this time. We can't continue along this path.
Yeah. And I think the visual, for me, I kept saying that it was such an intimate murder, right? Intimate in that the police officer's knee was on his neck. When someone speaks and says, I can't breathe, he had to have felt the vibrations from the vocal cords. He had to have felt the warmth of the man's body. He had to, that's a very intimate, not in a good way, but just proximity, where body upon body is there. That for me is what is so maddening, what is so horrific, that we got that kind of visual, that kind of intimate and up close picture that hit our humanity perhaps in different ways. Shonda, as someone who is not African American, I like what you were saying earlier about the solidarity of people of color. What, from your perspective and your own community and other communities, has been the difference, the tipping point? Do you see a shift? Do you see those kinds of differences? What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, I know. I really appreciate that. And one thing I want to just want to add to what what Dr. Francis was saying a moment ago, that I think is really a testament to her work, to the work of activists who really came into their own in the wake of Michael Brown's murder. I think when we were witness to what happened to George Floyd, there had been people working for a decade already on addressing the unjust behaviors and the way that the Minneapolis Police Department functioned. They had already gotten people on the city council who were supportive of a defund the police strategy. And if we want to unpack the conversation about defund the police later, maybe we can. But there were folks who had been working for years who had been emboldened by what happened in Ferguson and across the country, who kept working when the media gaze, and if you'll forgive me, the white gaze turned away from that. And so part of why we have all of these amazing initiatives showing up in Los Angeles, in Minneapolis, in Oakland, in Atlanta, is because a sizable number of people wouldn't let up just because the media stopped paying attention to this issue. And so consistently for years, one of the Oakland Peace Center partners, the Black Organizing Project, has been working for 10 years to remove police from the Oakland public schools, because while they were in theory put there to protect children and youth from gang violence, from other kinds of violence, they never decreased any of the violence in the schools. They increased harassment specifically of students of color, and most of our students in OUSD are students of color, and they resulted in the death of a student. It has taken 10 years, but 2 weeks ago, the youth and young adults who had grown up in those schools and the Black Organizing Project succeeded in passing the George Floyd Amendment to remove police from the schools. They never let up. They kept doing that work day after day, even when this wasn't an issue that everyone was talking about anymore. And when this horrific, heartbreaking moment showed up, they were equipped to move to respond to it in profound and visionary ways. So I just want to celebrate that and honor that tenacious work. Because people are like, well, Minneapolis can't just defund the police all of a sudden. And I'm like, they're not. That's not what's happening. They are building on 10 years of best practices and strategy and policy analysis. And just because you stopped paying attention doesn't mean they did. And so I think that's really beautiful. So I just wanted to say that. What I will say about solidarity is, for any of us from immigrant communities who have been doing this work for a long time, this past 4 years has been really painful. And I don't just mean what's been happening in the administration, but the response of our communities to what's been happening in this administration has been painful, because for those of us, say from the South Asian community, who lived through 9/11, we couldn't figure out why our community wasn't more afraid of what was going on. But the reality is, most of our community has immigrated here since 9/11. They don't know the history. They didn't live through the terror. And I don't think most Americans understand the double terror that we felt in that moment. We were terrified of the terrorists, and we were terrified of our fellow citizens. And our people were disappearing without us having any idea of where they were going. And sometimes they never came back. It was a terrifying time, and I thought that would be enough for our community to be, empowered to address systemic injustices. But because of the way immigration works, most of them didn't live through it and didn't fully believe it. So what's been powerful about this moment is it has been awakening also for immigrant communities. And even before this moment around the movement for Black Lives resurging, what was happening in the camps, the concentration camps that this country has set up for immigrants along the border. And I call them concentration camps because that's the technical United Nations definition. What we're doing are actually concentration camps in the same way that we did during World War II. And there are Asian immigrants in those camps, as well as Latino immigrants in those camps. And there are African immigrants in those camps. And so as we become aware of the ways these systems create a conditional relationship that we have to this country, it's been an awakening. And this moment really was an apocalyptic, a breakthrough moment, I think, for a lot of our even first generation immigrants, who most of the time, first generation folks, our strategy, our parents' strategy is you keep your head down, that's how you survive. And that's something we learned before we got to this country. You keep your head down, that's the way you survive. And you try to get your children to do well enough that they don't just have to survive. But this moment really has been very much a breakthrough moment. And I think there's been a little bit of, this is always going to be conditional. We're never going to be fully accepted. Who are our people in this moment? And it's really created some powerful opportunities. Asian Pacific Environmental Network is one of my favorite organizations, and they are partnering with Faith in Action, the national PICO network, to increase API voter registration. We're looking at really mobilizing Asian voters in Texas. There's a lot of work going on to help our communities recognize our power as well as our solidarity. That was a really excessively long answer to your question, Reverend Owens. I apologize.
No, that's helpful. That's helpful. I think that notion of solid, talk a little bit later, voter engagement, because I know that's something that's really important to Dr. Francis as well as you. But I want to pivot just a minute because she and I are clergy. Dr. Francis, your husband is clergy. You've been engaged in the church, and one of the big impacts that happened in Ferguson was the way in which clergy came alongside young leaders who were in the street in than we saw modeled perhaps in the 1960s. I'm old enough to have remembered at the NAACP gatherings in the basement of my grandfather's church, and all the wise, mostly men who were leading at that point in time. The women were in the background doing all the hard work. But I also remember clergy, my friend Tracy Blackman, who pastors in St. Louis, and her stories of being an older clergy person and respecting what the young leaders were doing. I think that's a lesson for churches of every stripe, for faith movements, and not just Christian movements. Concerned about the secularization of America and young people not being interested in faith of any kind. And how do we now work as church, in our case, to ensure that we are listening, learning, and giving space to those voices? What did you learn, Leah, about Ferguson that speaks to this moment, about what we should be with our younger leaders?
One of the things that became apparent very quickly is that clergy who did want to lend their voices, their support, their resources, stepped into the moment with a significant amount of humility. And that humility meant that, you know, I don't come in as the know-it-all, okay, I'm here, now the party can get started. No, but coming in a genuine spirit of humility, first acknowledging that it was the young people who stood their ground and said, we're not having this anymore. And clergy coming in, you know, those coming in with a more, you know, humble spirit of saying, I'm here to help. I'm here to stand with you. I'm not here to just tell you what to do, but I'm here to offer the resources and support that I can in meaningful ways. So that is something that we saw repeatedly. Another thing, in addition to that spirit of humility, with that, having a willingness to apologize. And here's what I mean by that. And I learned this over the years, that, you know, the church writ large has not done a good job of making people feel welcome as they are. Specifically, and I'm not talking about any one congregation or anything like that, but just sort of writ large. We don't have the best reputation for that. And what that translates into is real bodies, real people who have been wounded, many young people, right? And so to have clergy coming in and saying, you know what, we're sorry that we haven't stood up, that we haven't spoken out, that we hadn't stood with, that we spent more time debating whether or not you should be able to come into our spaces because of who you love and how you love and how many tattoos you have or what clothes you wear. I mean, that's where the energy has gone, instead of opening our arms and our hearts wide to say, you know, come on, we love you, we welcome you. So apologizing, right? To say we haven't stood up. So that, in connecting to this moment now, as I have seen, and I'm sure each of us has in many ways, well, while yes, there's still many people that are not interested in engaging in this type of justice work or even disposition, we have seen many more who are kind of entering with that same spirit, going, gosh, you know, I'm sorry, this is wrong. We got to change this. So that's a real learning for me that I've always kept in my heart and my mind, and encourage others to think about as, you know, they too step into these waters.
Humility and apologizing, naming. I think that is so important. It's hard for me to accept the fact that I'm no longer in that category of young adult.
I know.
You know what I'm saying? It's like, I used to be the young, energetic person pushing everyone else to change and to hear me, and edging for making sure that I had a voice and somebody to hear our new ideas. And I think it's so important for those of us who are of a certain age to remember that they're different perspectives. My son is about to turn 30, getting married. He's not my little boy anymore. And having conversations, or just even listening to his perspective, he and his fiance, and the way in which they view this, the language that they use, the organizations that they've chosen to affiliate with are probably not the same that I would choose, but I have to listen. I want to listen. And we I'll just say that for any disciples who are listening, we need your voices at the table. We will make room for your voices. We have to have, I will be gone. Others will be gone. If we don't prepare and make space for younger leaders and begin to follow them and make space for them, all of the institutions that we think are already irrelevant will simply be cast aside, and they can't remain as they are anyway, right? They simply can't remain as they are. So I love that humility and apology. My friend Julia Middle, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to add to that as you talk about, Mitchell and so many of his generation, it's important to name that not only do we enter this work and these movements from our positions as clergy or leaders or teachers or whatever, but we are people that have real skin in this game. That one of the things that enrages me more than anything when I see such young people engaged is not the fact that they're engaged, but I'm like, why is this on our children's back? Like, we need to be standing up. I'm a mom of 2 young sons, and I need to be out here fighting and standing and saying no and working to dismantle the school to prison pipeline. Why is that on our children's back, and why are we okay with it being on our children's back? So that's another really important point that, I always try to raise to encourage us to keep in front of ourselves as much as we enter this space with humility and being willing to apologize and say, we haven't used our voices and our leverage in the ways that we always can for, advancing the cause for the movement for Black lives, but it doesn't have to continue that way.
That's right. We do have that responsibility. There is a role for elders, right? There is a role for elders that is not just one of standing silently by, but there's still work that we have to do. Thank you for that.
How much do I get to complicate this?
Go ahead and speak, Shonda.
Leah's like, do it or don't do it.
We're about halfway through our time, and I certainly want to get to the whole issue of voter suppression and engagement.
I'm just so all about what y'all are talking about. And I'm so excited about it. And I think this is the kind of what can the church do, which I know is part of the conversation we're trying to get to. So I know we're going out of order when we do this, but I really resonated with, I feel like one of the best organizing principles that I've learned around, I think the church makes a mistake over and over and over in thinking that we have to create the movement, which is too much. And we get overwhelmed by that. And we give up. I've watched churches do that over and over. And so one of the biggest learnings I keep passing along is there's folks in your community already doing the work. God's already at work in the community. How do you show up to support what God's already doing for justice? And that means humility. It means vulnerability. It means, and this is something I want to applaud First Christian Church of Oakland, which I was the pastor of for a number of years before going on to the Oakland Peace Center. When they realized they wanted to do the work of peace, we figured out who the peace builders, the folks disrupting violence in Oakland, which was one of the most violent cities in the country at the time. And we showed up to those organizations, very secular, youth-led, pretty radical organizations, and we said, how can we help? And they weren't used to hearing that from a church, which I think is heartbreaking. And they tested us. Can you hang up flyers for us? We will hang up flyers. Can you buy tickets to the Oakland A's Silence the Violence fundraising game? Yeah, we can buy tickets and show up to the game. Will you work security during the Turf Unity concert to make sure that people aren't bringing in weapons? Yes, we can do that. They tested us over and over because they didn't trust us not to come in and try to take over. And some of that has to do with something that we sometimes refer to as respectability politics. And so both of you are talking about how we create space for young people and how we show up for them. And where I have seen that unravel over and over is, I remember folks from Occupy showing up at one of the churches in Oakland and talking like folks at Occupy Oakland did. And the pastor is like, "You will not disrespect God by cursing in this space." And that was the end of the relationship. And I'm not sure he was wrong to do that. And I'm not sure we could afford to stand by that principle over the one that they were fighting for. And this kind of thing, I think, is a reality of if we're going to show up and support and help the work of young leadership, what does it look like to do it on their terms or with compassion or without judgment? And I think that is very hard for us. And I'm not talking to white churches, I'm talking to churches of color. That is a breaking point for a lot of us. And I think that's something we need to pay attention to.
I think you're, no, go ahead, Leah.
Can I tell a quick story related to
Sure.
that thing that happened in Ferguson? So through the interviews that I was able to do, Reverend Jackie Foster, who is a disciples pastor in St. Louis, and whose church opened their doors wide to the movement in St. Louis. And because it was happening all over the city, protests all over the city, somewhere near her church. Well, one day she said she and her husband and many others were out protesting and walking towards St. Louis University. And there was an older pastor who was walking with them, an African-American pastor, and lots of young people. And as anybody who's been in a protest knows, that the chants aren't always, "Please let us come and tell you what we need and we'll hope you give it to us." That's not how the chants work. So they're colorful and and fiery. And so here was the funny part. She said that the people were chanting and the chants had some curse words in them. And the pastor who was walking near them said, "Language." And in the, but in the very next breath, he said, "But the young people have done it. They have done it." So not in a "y'all stop talking like that" way, but in a very, grandparent kind of way, language, at the same time, wholeheartedly acknowledging what they have done and the fact that he's obviously supportive. They're marching with them. So that was just to illustrate some of what you were talking about,
100%.
Shonda.
And I love that, because I love the idea of the movement being intergenerational and there being enough trust and relationship that those moments can show up, right? Because it's not just we do it on their terms, which I know is what I said, but it's when have we built enough trust and relationship across generations that we can show up in those spaces. There are chants that I drop out of when I'm marching in the streets because they don't align with with the way I understand myself to engage the work. They don't engage with my spirit, but I keep marching.
Yeah. I so appreciate what you both have said. I think one of the things that we also struggle with in the church is that notion of judgmentalism and inclusion, and not remembering the real radical roots of our whole movement. Shonda, you and I were both a part of the Alliance Q worship service during to close out Pride Month in June, and they chose as their text what's often called the cleansing of the temple, Jesus flipping tables. This is Jesus who flipped a weapon. He didn't hurt anybody, although somebody may have gotten hit by one of those tables, but he expressed his anger and dissatisfaction, and he said, "Enough is enough, not going to take this anymore." And that kind of anger and energy, I think, is necessary. And it is a part of our expression, even as people of faith. At a certain point, or at all points, really, we should not be willing to tolerate those things that violate the command of God to love. If love is so central to who we are, it's a pretty expansive and it has really high standards. Jesus says, love as I have loved you. That's, some of us don't love ourselves well enough to love others, but Jesus says, nah, love the way I've loved you. That's a higher bar. And so if you, just basic things, if you want a decent place to live and food on your table and a roof over your head and education for your children and for your kids to be able to walk to and from school, or if for your teenage son to be able to drive a car without fear of being accosted by police and killed just because he turned his head a particular way or reached for the wrong thing. If you want that for yourself, then you got to want it for me. And so love can't just be singing hymns and professing love of Jesus Christ. If you don't love me, C.T. Vivian, one of Dr. King's field generals who just passed away last weekend, says you can't be racist and be Christian. Those two things just can't coincide. I hear a lot of concern about whether, should we be saying Black Lives Matter? Or what are we doing about evangelism? Why are we doing the work of justice? I think this is a perennial issue that the Christian church, and indeed people of all faiths, have to wrestle with, that the work of justice is the work of evangelism. It's offering the good news by praying with our feet, putting feet to our faith, all of those things. So I just need to get my little soapbox there. So feel free to write me cards and letters. This is the work. This is the work that Jesus commands us to do. And it has to be real and relevant as we do it. We've got about 20 minutes left. I want to get into our conversation that we have begun sort of offline about not only a call to action, but just the whole topic of voter engagement, what's happening in our country right now, voter suppression happening in ways that we really haven't seen since pre-1965. Or maybe we have seen it, it's been there, it just hasn't been reported. But now, since the Civil Rights Act was gutted by not renewing some of those provisions, it's given people cover. Would one of you want to engage? Leah, I know that's something you're actively engaged in. So maybe you want to speak to that?
Whew, let me take a breath. It is stunning that in the year 2020, that we are in the space that we are when it comes to voting. Let me just say that, that, one would reasonably think that after the Civil Rights Movement and the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Acts, that we would not be dealing with the level of a well-orchestrated plan of voter suppression whose tentacles go in so many directions and impact everyday people in so many ways. It's just unbelievable. And that too is something that the church needs to be struggling, vocalizing against, because it is in violation of every right possible. So what do we do in the face of that? In addition to seeking to work to have our rights strengthened, to have them acknowledged, being able to give people the education, the information, the inspiration that would be helpful to get them engaged in the voting process. Now, I know that you all probably have, and so many other people have heard people say, well, why should I vote? What difference does it make? They just so happen to misplace voter ballots and all these kinds of things. My vote doesn't matter. And the truth of the matter is that even in the midst of all of these various voter suppression and voter theft tactics, like we saw in 2018 in Florida and Georgia, we still cannot afford to not engage in the process, that we still have to seek to elect people that are going to uphold their oath of office to do right and justly by all citizens. And by not engaging is a surefire way to continue to believe, to have people who are doing the opposite. And so I think a huge part of our work is not just telling people, okay, just go vote, 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 but rather one, we still have to keep doing our work of making sure that the people we're asking folks to vote for are actually doing things or proposing to do things that are in their interests, that are for the good of all people. It's not, just go vote for whoever. No, they need to also have some commitment to do the kinds of things, enact the kind of policies, stand for the kind of practices that are going to be for all well-being, and particularly in this moment related to this conversation, the mattering of Black lives. And so to engage people in that process, to remember that every year people are turning 18 years old, and so often in congregations, people will say, lots of congregations I've been in particularly African-American congregations will, say vote, vote, vote. But I'm like, oftentimes many people in front of you are going to vote. What are we doing to engage those who have not been active in the process? How are we reaching out? How are we becoming uncomfortable, if you will, to go beyond our immediate sphere of influence, to really engage, others, to talk about, the how and the why and the what, and most importantly, to listen.
Yeah, I think that's so important, going beyond those, and that's true anything the church does, right? Getting beyond our four walls. Now we have no four walls. We're in virtual spaces. But yeah, I was telling the story of when my son turned 18, I simply insisted that he register to vote, and we have always engaged him in age-appropriate ways. I remember they had in Indianapolis at St. Richard's School, they had a mock election for the first time that Bill Clinton was elected. And he was able to clearly articulate who he was voting for and why in kindergarten, because he had those kinds of conversations. And I think that the sooner we make even our kids and the communities that we have influence with, having those real conversations. It's not just about party, it's not right or left, it's really about right and wrong. As you say, making sure that the people we vote for have our interests at hand, and moving beyond even the assumption that everyone that's around us are voting, but that we are paying attention to people beyond our communities, and certainly even our own families. Shonda, you want to weigh in on this notion of voter suppression?
I think this is a profoundly theological question, right? So I really appreciate it being raised in the context of churches. I want to get out of the way that we just lost Congressman John Lewis, and he was famous for saying, if our vote didn't matter, they wouldn't keep trying to take it away from us. And I think that in and of itself is a profound awareness for us to carry. I think the fact that the Supreme Court still hasn't had the chance to weigh in on a joint a case being brought by African Americans from North Carolina and Latinos from Texas around voter suppression efforts in those states. And we know a lot about, there's been lots of jokes about Get Out of Dodge and how a primarily Latino immigrant community has had the one polling station in Dodge, Kansas taken away from them during the last election, so that they were required to drive hours to another polling place. So we have tangible illustrations of how this is happening. The debates over mail-in ballots, all of that is part of this conversation about access to votes. And it's a profoundly theological issue, in that we worship a savior, and in the Disciples of Christ, we take that seriously. We worship a savior who prioritized the voices of people who were ignored by the rest of the society. And part of the dream of what America was supposed to be, and I'm not saying it has ever been fully actualized, but the dream of what America was supposed to be, that we keep fighting for, because maybe someday it could be, is a country in which everybody's voice does matter. A country in which we don't have to proclaim that Black lives matter because everybody knows that already. A country in which we don't have to fight for our rights as queer folks or women or immigrants, because this is a country that knows that we are a better country when those rights are protected. And so for us to engage the ballot box, honestly, in these days, as harm reduction, of electing the person who is going to do the least harm in the community and working to get in candidates who will do real good, which is an exciting thing I'm involved in here in Oakland, and I won't get into. We've got a candidate who is a radical housing justice activist who organized the Moms for Housing campaign. We're trying to get her on city council in my district. And that's, you know, that's profound and exciting work. But even when it's, you know, voting for the lesser of two evils, do you know how many lives get saved when we vote for the lesser of two evils? Understanding voting also as harm reduction and as reason enough to show up at the polls, I think is important. But for us to engage the ballot as a theological document, as a document that says, who do we want to be as a city or a town or a state or a country, I think is some of the most profound theological work we can do in the church. That'd be a Bible study I'd show up for.
Yeah, the Bible study and a good history lesson. I think there's so many people who are miseducated or uneducated about the history of voter suppression, and people are uneducated about the history and impact of racism in so many ways. But that's a legacy. People think that just because laws are passed, that certain things have gone away. People don't take seriously when they hear they've just gutted the Voting Rights Act. People don't take seriously when they hear that polling stations have been diminished. Here in Calumet City, south of Chicago, the last presidential election, there were robocalls that people were getting saying that the polls were closing early, trying to redirect people. There were lots of that kind of activity happening. And people getting messages that, oh, if you're in line and the polls close at 6 and you haven't gotten in, you're not going to be able to vote. So a lot of misinformation was being spread, both on social media and by phone calls. And because people are often, if they're not familiar with the process, or they think that we're sort of afraid, right? We get treated at the polls like somehow we have to prove that we're worthy to be there. That's one thing that really, this is our right, right? It's not a privilege, it is our right to vote. And we're examined as if we're coming to apply for a car loan or something.
Yes.
How do you get in the door? Are you here? Any sketchy, I've served as a poll judge in different primaries in Cook County, Illinois, which is a whole other creature. But we have to get to the point where voting, it is truly treated as a right, and we don't get to decide who's worthy enough to hold that right and to exercise that right. And we could go on and on about that, but
a part of that comes from acknowledging that so much of the disenfranchisement we see happens in community of colors.
Yes,
communities of color. You know, that I've lived in
most of it happens
7 states now, right? And in all different kinds of spaces. And there have been many polling places where I've gone into, and everything's fine. The lines aren't too long, and everybody's welcoming, and nobody's interrogating folks or anything like that. But that's not the case for so many places that are too often communities of color. And so to name that is really, really, really important to help folks understand where the change needs to happen, because voter disenfranchisement is not happening for everybody. It's not impacting everybody. And all too often, just like, you know, when we have racial profiling with policing, because that only happens to certain people. You get people that say, well, what's the problem? You know, that never happens to me. That doesn't happen to my neighbors. And so you must have done something wrong. And the same thing with voting. Oh, well, you must have not completed the information correctly. No, we know that's not the case. So education, states like where we live here in Indiana, you need an ID to vote. You know, what are the laws in that particular state in which someone lives? Do they know that? Are we sharing that information? Are we putting up as many, putting out as many ways and as much information as possible to try to reduce the impact of the barriers that we know are being erected is essential.
Right. I want to invite those of you who are watching, if you're on the Zoom with us, to put your comments, or not comments, your questions into the chat. I haven't been able to look as much at questions that are coming in over Facebook Live. I've seen more comments there. But if you have a question, put into the chat. Shonda, if you're on the Zoom, has just put in a resource for people who are looking to talk about faith and voting. Great starting place that a lot of disciples are engaged in, as she gives a link there. We will have that, and we'll try to grab that from the chat and also put it out on our
I did it on Facebook. I wasn't able to do it on YouTube.
Okay,
yeah.
Great. But Shonda has put out that link. And before we leave, Leah, we want you to point people towards some work that you would encourage people to get in. Someone has asked the question, could you speak to the importance of lament in the current situation? I feel like the protests and demonstrations are lamenting. If the church understood lament better, would that we more quickly join with the movement?
So I love that question because that's really pretty much all I did in June. The Oakland Peace Center sponsored a 12-hour prayer vigil for folks who couldn't be in the streets, to pray for the healing and health and victory of the young Black leaders in the streets all across the country. And the reality is, because it was intentionally a space that centered Black leadership and Black voices, it naturally interwove throughout those 12 hours the reality of lament. It was one of the most profoundly spiritual experiences I've had. And it's critical, because I think we function within a white supremacist culture. I'm using shorthand, and I'm going to ask you all to forgive me for that, for not unpacking it. But part of that culture is to push down grief. Part of that culture is to read anger as threatening, when in fact anger is almost always a secondary emotion that is a manifestation of grief. And if every time we were witness to absolute outrage at injustice and could notice that it's born of heartbreak, I think it would allow us to enter into this work in a different way. So I really affirm that, and as well as it being profoundly biblical. We had, and I think it's still available online, we co-sponsored with a number of POC and Black-led organizations a communal day of grief. A number of organizations from North Carolina and from Oakland, kind of a bi-coastal event, because we needed it, because COVID is disparately impacting communities of color. Black, Indigenous, Asian, are all being profoundly disparately impacted by COVID. And we're carrying so much grief, because when people say, well, I don't know anyone who's died, I'm like, who are your friends? How have you not lost anybody? And what does that tell me about your world? And I apologize for that being judgmental, because people in rural areas sometimes haven't had those direct connections, because it's hard, the spread is slower in some rural areas. So that might be part of it. But COVID and George Floyd's murder and the many murders around that really required us to do some grieving. So I really appreciate that being named. That rage and lament are actually two sides of the same coin. And if we are afraid of anger, we are rejecting grief, is something for us to really wrestle with as a church that is so committed to unity that we often do it at the expense of people who are enraged or grieving.
Lament calls us to sit in the discomfort of the truth of what is happening, what has caused it, and what God is calling us to do in response to it. To quickly always want to jump from, oh, that's so bad, to, well, where's the hope? Let's talk about hope. No, we're not going to talk about hope. We're going to talk about what's going on, and we're going to deal with it. We're going to feel it. We're going to bring it into all of our senses. You know, when shortly after George Floyd was killed, and we talked earlier about how people around the country were saying enough and having protests, I reached out to Faith in Indiana, the executive director here in Indianapolis, and said, hey, can we do a clergy march downtown? And she was like, absolutely. And so we get downtown with 1,500 people, they estimated, came out. And at the end of it, we did a die-in. And most people know what a die-in is, but for those who may not, what it is where you physically lie on the ground as best you can. And we did that for 8 minutes and 46 seconds in honor of the time that George Floyd laid on the ground. And while that was happening, several of us read the names of many other people, men, women, and children that had been killed by police officers around the country, the more than 100 names in just the past 6 years. And I can't tell you how many emails, calls, conversations I've had about that, of people saying, oh my gosh, we really felt the gravity of what this means. And Lament calls us to empathize. I am so tired of hearing people say, well, like you all, I don't know anybody who's died, or that's never happened to me. My spouse has never been pulled over. Why does it take that? Why do you not have the human capacity to empathize, to imagine, gosh, if that were happened to me or to my son or my daughter, I would be devastated. So Lament calls us to feel, it calls us to stay grounded in the moment, not jump to the hope, and also calls us to empathy.
Yes. Yeah. Again, to think that only if it happens to you is it real, that only what happens to you. One of our Facebook friends said, you know, and this is a white man who wrote this, saying, white people think their experience too often is the normative one. And so if it's not happening to me, then there's no reality in it. It's not happening. But the inability to imagine or to empathize or to have even any kind of compassion for the fact that it is happening to others means that I should care about it. That's where the depth of that deeply theological understanding of love simply has to come forward. We must care about it because it's happening to people who were also created in the image of God. That's why we have to care about it. That's why we have to take action. I don't have any other questions in the chat, and we're just about an hour. I want to offer you each the space to share what you wanted to challenge our viewers and listeners with. What everyone's saying, oh, what can I do? What can I do? And I want to hear from each of you about some immediate action steps or things that are close to your heart that you want to guide, point people towards, and offer a challenge and a charge. What should we be doing?
I'm going to let Leah have the last word because she's one of my heroes. I fell in love with her the first time I met her. So she's going to give really, really amazing wisdom on that. I'm going to share a link with you all because I have received so many requests from folks who are saying, I don't know where to start. I know that this is a problem. I don't know that my congregation is ready to have this conversation. I don't know that I've figured all my stuff out about it. And, you know, just a spoiler alert, none of us has. We're all so shaped by this culture of white supremacy. All of us are on a lifelong journey around it. But I felt I was encouraged strongly to create a little course that folks can be engaged in if they're interested in, that kind of parallels pre-post racial America, but is a little more action oriented and is geared towards individuals. So I'm putting that out there, and my friend who is helping me launch it, Katie Valentine, has set up all of the systems for people to join, and she set up a 20% discount for everybody who is joining today. That said, so I wanted to offer that. I also wanted to name that what we talked about earlier around who are the folks in your community doing the work? Who are the youth who are organizing? And how can you reach out to them and say, how can we help? Do you need snacks? Do you need masks? Do you need people to form a wall of protection? To show up for them and find out what they need is a really profound step in building the relationships that are essential to really building God's kingdom here on earth.
Amen. And Katie has, for those of you on the Zoom webinar, Katie has put the link to that class and resource there. So thank you for sharing that. And hopefully, Katie, you can put that out on the Facebook page as well so that it's in those comments. And we'll be combing through the chat and picking up any important links and making sure that we get that information back out on our social media after this event. But Leah, I'll give you the final comments here.
No, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation with you all. Shonda, I love all of those resources. And what I would add to that is to encourage people to also start in your homes. Start among your friends. Start with your friends who won't wear a mask. Start with your mom's groups. Start, you know, there at the Thanksgiving dinner tables. You know, there are so many that are right within our sphere that we will too often just, you know, stay silent, not say anything, not want to rock the boat. But now is the time. You know, I look at the work that the Poor People's Campaign has done with Reverend Barber and Reverend Owens has been so graciously engaged with, in looking at how they've done so much work to build coalitions and to say this is about all of us together caring for the least of these, to not be afraid. Right. To say, you know, this is what I stand for. This is what I believe God is calling us to. So right where you are, take the risk, be willing to be uncomfortable and say, no, this is the work that we need to do. This is how all people need to be valued as human beings and beloved children of God. But starting, in addition to connecting with these various wonderful organizations and resources, to also don't neglect to start right where you are in your homes, in your neighborhoods, among your friends and circles.
Amen. Amen. I want to just add on the work of the Poor People's Campaign. The Christian Church Disciples of Christ was the first denomination to officially vote that in our General Assembly that we would encourage every expression of our church, congregational, regional, general, to support that work. This Sunday, they're going to be rebroadcasting the June 20th event, but they're also kicking off a voter registration and engagement campaign. They have published on poorpeoplescampaign.org the policy platform, the moral Mass Moral Assembly and Moral Jubilee public policy platform that is there. You need to educate yourselves about the issues and how you can be in solidarity. So I encourage people to go to that website to understand what positions people of faith and people of just goodwill can take on these important issues. I'm grateful for all the disciples that are engaged across the U.S., in particular with not only the Poor People's Campaign, but Faith in Action, formerly known as PICO. We've got a strong cohort there in Indianapolis, and all across the U.S. we have young disciples engaged in this work, educating, but also putting feet to their faith, putting their bodies on the line. To speak and work for justice, advocating for appropriate legislation, working to get folks registered, advocating against voter suppression. This is the work of God. This is the work of God. It's the work of love for a wider community. So I want to thank Dr. Leah Gunning Francis and Reverend Sandhya Jha. I look forward to the day when we can all have lunch, and I'm able to get Leah and I try to have lunch when we can in Indy, and Shonda, when I'm out that way, we usually try to break some bread, share a drink or something while we're gathering. So
and
thank you so
march
much.
Together.
And march together. We've marched together. I've already been out. The only times I've really been in public since COVID hit were 2 marches here in Chicago. My son and his fiance joined us for one of those, and it's been you know, I'm of an age where I know what came before me, and to not put my own body out there, to not advocate and not be in solidarity with this movement is to deny who I am and where I've come from. So I'm grateful for all the young people that I've met along the way, and for all the young people in our church that are moving and keeping us honest and challenging us to be better and to do better and to engage without fear. So it's time to flip some tables, I think, and continue to do the work. So thank you all for this conversation tonight. Some of you have asked, it is being recorded. You'll be able to find this recording on our Facebook page because it was streamed live. So that recording will show up once the session is over. And you'll also be able to find it on the Christian Church Disciples of Christ YouTube channel. So we're so grateful for all of you. One final announcement. Starting next Thursday, July 30th, at the same time, 7 Eastern, 6 Central, Reconciliation Ministry and the Office of the General Minister and President will be kicking off a series of town halls. April Johnson, our Reconciliation Minister, and I issued a call to action and indicated that we were planning these town halls. They start next July 30th. The first panel will be an intergenerational panel of white disciples clergy talking about how white people deal with the understanding of their own complicity in racism. That will be the first conversation. Shonda's actually helping us to put together a conversation around identity and theology and community for our NAPAD, our Asian and Pacific Islander communities. We'll have one where we're focusing on the Black Lives Matter movement. We will have one talking about just borders and the immigration issue that's being organized by Obra Hispana, our Hispanic churches. So it's going to be a very varied and inclusive series, but one where we're going to have some folks coming to the table to name some tough issues and talk about how we as a church can respond and what we can actually do in our communities. So with that, you'll be hearing more about that on our social media, so watch out for that. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. And again, to Dr. Francis and Reverend Jha, thank you so much. Love you both, and God be with you.
Love
Take care.
you
Likewise.
both.
Love you
Thank
tons.
you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
All right.
Bye-bye, everybody. Good night.
Bye-bye.
Good
Good night.
night.